Hello and welcome to my video on demand side policies. There's quite a lot of things to talk about today, so I'm just going to quickly show you those definitions there, and you can have a look at those yourself. They're the main ones that people will struggle with. Right, moving on. We've got our demand side policies are made up of fiscal policy, which is the first three that you see here, and monetary policy, which are the bottom two you see at the bottom. Now, one big problem when we're talking about demand side policies is not being able to get the correct component of AD. So, for example, for G, an increase in government expenditure, we often see that people say that will increase consumption. Well, the direct effect of an increase in government expenditure obviously is an increase in government expenditure. The consumption increase is actually something to do with the multiplier. So just first thing to say, get the right components. They are listed there. The supply side impact, well, that could be a valuation after you finished, and you could say that some of these things might impact the quality and quantity of the factors of production. So you might say the government spends on healthcare, it's paying a builder to build a hospital, but that hospital then treats people in the future, improves the workforce, more days spent working, more economic growth, higher LRAS in the future. That's going to generally be in the future. Other impacts, you can look down that column there, by the way, for other examples of that. Other impacts, well, you notice here straight away that all of the fiscal policies, when they're expansionary, as these all are, will result in issues with budget deficits, which is why we're limited in how much we can use them. And you'll notice also, I'm not going to talk about the multiplier today, so I'll just skip over that, but it is relevant. But also, of the other ones, the big limit is confidence. So for corporation tax, for income tax, for interest rates, we're expecting the private sector, we're expecting consumers and firms to spend. And we're manipulating one variable and hoping that that will change their behavior. But what if everything else, the other variables that affect them, are negative, and they will be in a recession? So we will talk about that a little in the coming few minutes. And finally, quantitative easing. This is the policy that we've chosen to use just because we've run out of our other policies. When you're losing your demand side policy, there's a tendency to skip over this analysis here. You want to say what the policy is, so demand side policy, interest rate. You want to define that, borrowing cheaper. You want to say who's impacted and why, borrowing, durable consumption investment. And then you want to then say the component, the shift, and the result. Please don't jump through that. That is not helpful. You do need all those chains of logical reasoning. Okay, moving on. Let's give some ideas of some of the application to the UK economy and put it into context. So government spending, a fiscal policy. We like it because it could improve equality and growth at the same time. So we could spend it on health or education or infrastructure in poor regions. So we can target it in that way. We can target it, for example, for the infrastructure to boost long-run potential growth. Maybe there's something negative in our economy, or our infrastructure isn't good enough. We can target it on our weaknesses. And crucially, it creates a direct impact. When confidence is low, we don't need to rely on other people spending for us. We have that direct impact, and that then creates other impacts. It raises incomes, raises consumption through the multiplier, which is also great. However, this is the big problem you can see in this graph. Total government spending all the way from 2000 has been greater every year than our tax revenue, the blue line. Notice particularly during the pandemic, we've had a jump in government spending from 38-9% of GDP to 52% of GDP, a huge increase. So that's an example of an expansionary demand side policy, very useful during the pandemic. The government expenditure is replacing the lost consumption and investment as we went into lockdowns. But it's not sustainable. and we can only borrow so much. Currently, we have a GDP to debt ratio of 100%. So that means that we have the whole of the annual UK GDP is equal to its amount of debt, so around £2 trillion or thereabouts, a little bit more. So that's an incredible amount of debt, which means that we are limited in future government expenditure. Taxation. Now, taxation, there's lots of different taxes, so they can be targeted in that way using indirect taxes, corporation taxes, income taxes, all sorts of different taxes that you can use here, and they can be quite targeted. And they are generally relatively easy to change, particularly income tax. Income taxes generally aren't put up or down, but we can change where the bands are. And you can see these are the bands of tax for the UK progressive income tax system. The point to note here is that if I'm earning this amount here, £12,571, I pay 20p in tax. I have a 0% on my first 12,570, that's called the personal allowance, and then I only pay 20% on tax in this bracket here. Now I only start to pay 40% tax once I get to £50,271, so I only pay 40% on that £1. Now if I go up to the higher rate here, I don't start to then pay 40% tax in the basic rate as well. So it's only on the additional. If you had a tax rates which were all 10%, 10, 10, 10, 10, that would be called a proportional tax system. And if you had it falling, say from 50 to 40, 30, it's not a very nice system, is it that? Why would you tax the poor more? That would be called a regressive tax system. And you can play around with those boundaries and the individual tax rates, and you can create incentives, particularly to work harder, which would be the supply side effect. If you were to pull down the top rates of tax, maybe people would work harder to try to earn more money. Now, corporation tax, very badly defined generally, is a tax on profit, not a tax on revenue. You can see that across the world there are marked differences in tax rates. Average is 23% across the world, but you can see that Russia and the UK, Ireland particularly, are lower in their corporate tax rates. And Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa are particularly high. Now, countries are in competition with each other, and you can see that the worldwide tax rates have been falling on corporations for the last 40 years, and that really is to do with incentivizing FDI. That's foreign direct investment. So I could incentivize a multinational company to come to my country if I've got a low tax rate. So someone like Ireland with its 12.5% tax rate, I think it's 12.5, it might be 12, will incentivize Apple and Google to come there because they can pay lower tax. And that then pulls in a huge amount of investment and creates lots of jobs, shifting AD right, which is a very good policy. And developing countries often use this too. The issue with that is that we create this competition between countries, and that's created this race to the bottom, it's called. Now, will firms react to corporation tax changes if we put them down? Well, yes and no. FDI possibly more likely, but firms are very sensitive to economic conditions. So even if you put corporation tax rates down, if economic conditions are unfavourable, it's likely that they still won't invest. You have to be confident if you're going to invest. And corporation tax doesn't necessarily change the overall macroeconomic environment. They must believe it's going to be long run. It's no use just having corporation tax reduced today. I need it reduced tomorrow because I'm going to borrow today and I'm going to use my future profits, my future post-tax profits to pay back my loans. And right now we have a global tax agreement which on multinationals has set a global corporation tax rate, which I believe is 12%. And that might mean that you're limited in what you can do in this race to the bottom, like doing as Ireland did. Okay, interest rates. Interest rates, cost of borrowing, it's not really about saving. This is all about incentivizing borrowing. And you can see that over Brexit here at this point, there, and during the pandemic we have dropped rates. Key thing, 0.1% during the pandemic, but you can't really go further than that, so they are limited as to how far you can drop them. Now, investment and consumption should increase because the interest rate is the cost of borrowing. If we make borrowing cheaper, we borrow to invest and we borrow to consume. We buy houses and we build warehouses. However, the investment is also affected by lots of other things as well. It's affected by how profitable you are, how much debt you have as a company, the technology that you are inventing. If more technology, you might invest more, and your view of future macroeconomic conditions, your view of your future demand. If you don't think you're going to be able to sell more goods in the future, why are you expanding your company by building new warehouses, for example, and factories? That wouldn't make sense, even if the interest rate were low. Consumption, yes, the interest rate. When the interest rate goes down, I'm going to buy a house because mortgages are cheaper. But my current earnings, my current debt, and my job right now will affect that arguably more than the interest rate. So I would argue that these bottom things affect consumption and investment more than the interest rate. And if they're going the other way, interest rates may not be particularly effective. Let's have a look. This is maybe something you haven't seen before, but if you drop the interest rate from R1 to R2, you could argue that investment and consumption are interest rate inelastic. 10% fall in the interest rate, a 1% increase in investment and consumption. Why? Well, that would happen during a recession where people are lacking in confidence, where people don't want to invest and consume, and even a cheap interest rate is not going to incentivize them. It's not going to change the fact that I think I'm going to lose my job, I don't therefore want to be in debt, and I think I'm going to go bust. I'm going to go bankrupt, so therefore I don't want to take on more loans and make that more likely. To argue against that, though, you might argue that a fall in the interest rate means that international savers therefore demand fewer of your pounds, of your currency, pushing the exchange rate down. If you do that, exports for your country get cheaper, and therefore you could argue that even though C and I, they're going to go up, but maybe not by a huge amount if you're in a recession, but exports will go up as well. So actually, they're also stimulating AD. Because of the limits of the other policies, because we have a limited amount of money, a limited ability to borrow, and we have a limited ability to push interest rates down, and a limited ability to force banks to loan and to force homeowners and firms to take those loans, quantitative easing was a policy devised after the last recession in 2008, or previous recession before that in 2008. And up until November 2020, as you can see, the cumulative quantitative easing is up to £895 billion. You can read that yourself as to what happens. I'm just going to explain it quickly here, that the Bank of England, it decides to print some money. It creates, say, £50 million, and it buys these government bonds in commercial banks. The bond is transferred to the government. The 50 million in cash is transferred to the commercial bank. Commercial banks don't want cash because it declines in value in real terms. So what do they do with it? Well, the HSBC, they're going to lend it hopefully to home owners. They want to make a return, and therefore you're going to see an increase in demand for houses from homeowners because there are more mortgages available because of the cash in banks. And that has driven this incredible increase in house prices after 2010. You can see that corresponds to the quantitative easing that's going on up there, and that creates something called the wealth effect. And the wealth effect means that consumers who feel wealthy will therefore consume more, and AD will shift right. Key thing to note here is this is not the government making cash and giving it. The central bank is not making cash for the government. That would be hyperinflation time, as in Germany and the Weimar Republic, that sort of thing. Okay, we'll take it up to there. I hope that made some sense.